Hi everybody and welcome back to my channel. It's Russell with Ink and Paper Blog. How are you today? I hope you are all doing very, very well. This is a very brief introduction to a video that I put together from my event with Jessie Chaffee and Geoff Nicholson. I know a number of you guys were interested to see if I could get it put up here on YouTube and my channel. I did get the permission of the bookstore and the permission of both authors and everyone to tape the event and put it up for you. So I hope you enjoy it. They were both fabulous and it was super exciting to do. So I hope you guys like it. Now, what I'm doing at the end of this video, what you can do is I'm giving a giveaway. I actually have, hold on, signed copies of both Jessie and Geoff's book, see, right here. They were signed on the date of my event that I'm giving away at the end of this video. And as always, the giveaway is for anyone, anywhere in the world that watches my channel. What I want you to do at the end of this is I want you to tell me a story about an author that you think should be either better known or as a debut author or as someone who is from a smaller press that you really think that more people should know about, and tell me about them and why you think and why you would be excited to see them in person. So that's sort of the entry into the giveaway, and I will send you their 2 books. The giveaway will be open for 2 weeks from today, which is Sunday, November 12th. And then we'll go from there. So I hope you guys enjoy this video. Jessie and Geoff were lovely, and East Bay Booksellers was a fantastic venue. And in the meantime, as always, happy reading. If you are a return subscriber to my channel, thank you so much. You know how much I appreciate that. And if you are a new subscriber, I hope you like this, and we will talk to you all very, very soon. Until next time, bye. What we're going to start off is they're each going to read. So I'm going to just do a little bit of a blurb on each of them. We'll start with Jessie, and then we'll go to Geoff, and then I'm going to read a small sample from their book. So, Carmen Maria Machado, who wrote Her Body and Other Parties, which is currently shortlisted for the National Book Award, wrote in her NPR review of Florence and Ecstasy that it is a beautiful but exhausting novel. Hannah is perpetually precarious. Every accomplishment feels hard-won, and every loss feels inevitable. Her hunger for food, for happiness, for meaning rises off the page, sharpens to a high pitch, balloons in elation, and then dissolves her. As you might expect, this is not a light beach read. No, it's not. But it is something that must be taken in small doses and savored page for page. So I introduced Jessie to read from Florence and Ecstasy. Thank you so much.
So I guess I'll read up at
go ahead and
read up at the podium. Thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see family and friends and new faces here. And thank you so much, Russell, for being up for doing this. Russell gave this Florence and Ecstasy a beautiful review, and as I was saying to him beforehand, there's nothing that is as meaningful to a writer than having somebody who reads your book deeply and really understands it and brings new insights to it. So thank you so much, Russell. And he's also the person who tweeted at me, "When are you coming to the Bay Area?" It inspired me to get out here too. So Florence and Ecstasy is about an American woman, Hannah, who flees from Boston to Florence in the aftermath of a number of challenges in her own life, including struggling with an eating disorder. So she is in Italy, a country filled with beauty and vitality and food, which is a complicated backdrop for her. She's initially very isolated, but she joins a rowing club in Florence where she learns to scull and begins to kind of reconnect with her own body, and also gets drawn into the social life of the city of Florence. At the same time, she, through art and lore, discovers the medieval and Renaissance women mystical saints who were famous for their ecstatic visions and also for starving themselves for God. So I'm going to read a short section from the first moment in which Hannah encounters one of these women from the past who become important to her story in the present. And it's the first time she leaves Florence. She goes to the hilltop town of Siena. Following signs that lead me through the original walls, I walk into the old center of Siena. It's early afternoon. The church services are over and the shop windows are dark. Only the occasional coffee bar is open, the interior a cool rectangle broken by no more than one or two bodies gripping espresso and glancing up at a small television. Soccer. The streets are tighter than Florence's, and the buildings on either side too close to me, slicing the sky into narrow strips. Siena is an older generation, cloistered and closed, and I feel trapped with nowhere to look but up at the church towers or down at my feet. I visit the unfinished Duomo, then drift to the edge of town, to a church balanced high on one of Siena's hills. It is massive but plain, and a worn wooden door on its side is almost unnoticeable. The door is open a crack, and I enter to find a similarly sparse interior, cool and hushed. Halfway up the nave, a woman kneels by a side chapel, but otherwise the basilica is empty. As soon as I take a few steps, however, a priest appears. He is small and old, with tufts of white hair around his ears. He squints at me, smiling, his lips folding into his face, and offers me a tour. Grazie, I say, and then realize my error. He begins speaking rapidly in Italian, but with such excitement that I don't stop him. He takes the edge of my sleeve and leads me to the back of the church, to a small fresco. Conosce Santa Caterina, he asks. I nod. Catherine of Siena. I studied her in college, or paintings of her anyway, and this one is familiar. She wears a black and white habit and holds a stalk of lilies. Her features are flat, her almond eyes lowered without expression, the proportions slightly off, and she has a greenish glow, eerie. On each of her hands sits a drop of blood, the stigmata. What else? She had visions and ecstasies, like St. Teresa, I think, and she claimed that she had married Jesus in a dream. We stand for a moment longer, the priest gazing up at the portrait and shaking his head. He looks close to tears. Then he takes the edge of my sleeve again, and we are off, he speaking and I not understanding, his feet shuffling along the marble floor with a shh, 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 and I try to step more lightly. He leads me to a chapel that is frescoed on 3 sides. At its center is a small ornate shrine, a mini cathedral. Questa è la sua testa, he says gravely. Her head, I ask? Si, her head, he confirms. Indeed, within the shrine is St. Catherine's mummified head, shrinking into a crisp white habit. The cheeks are sunken, the nose almost gone, the upper teeth visible. I look around to see if there are any children who might be traumatized by this medieval mummy, but it's only me and the priest and St. Catherine now. E anche il suo dito. He gestures to a glass case off to the side, where a single finger crooked points heavenward. Her finger? He nods happily and points upward too. He keeps smiling. This must be the end of the tour. He shakes his head when I offer him money, but gestures with great enthusiasm to the frescoed walls of the chapel and bows slightly before disappearing. I leave the dismembered saint to herself and look at the frescoes, which piece together Catherine's life. These images are more relatable. They have perspective and expression, and instead of a blank background, Catherine is out in the city, architecture and landscape behind her. In one image, she is collapsed, receiving the stigmata. She looks upward in ecstasy, her body not her own. On another wall, she prays for a man's soul as he is executed. His head, like hers, has been torn from its body. The third fresco stops me short. St. Catherine, right hand raised, stands over a young woman possessed by demons. A crowd has formed, but the people peer at her from behind pillars or hide their faces, shrinking back from the scene. Only St. Catherine is calm, her eyes down, her raised hand unmoving. The possessed woman writhes on the ground beneath her, her arms straining up at unnatural angles, her head thrown back. Which of these women am I? The one straining madly toward something unseen, or the calm one looking on? I have been both. In this past year, I have been both. I have been the mad woman, screaming, straining, digging ditches around the bone, sculpting. When did this start? my sister's voice, a flat note as she watched me disappear, and still I could not stop digging, could not stop sculpting. I would be well sculpted. But I was not mad. I was calm. She couldn't see that I was not only taking away, I was reaching for something. I was creating. I stand for what must be a long time in the little chapel in front of this fresco. Catherine's face belies nothing as she gazes at the possessed woman, but even the saint, I decide, was more than her patient reserve. I look at the first painting of Catherine in ecstasy, and then back to the image of this writhing woman. They seem the same, and I wonder if, in looking at this mad woman, St. Catherine recognized herself, frozen in one of her ecstasies, envisioning. Of course, she had been told that the woman was inhabited by an evil being, not God. Still, it seems to me that Catherine is looking in a mirror, and I wonder if she realized this, and if it struck her as odd that she had been asked to heal her own reflection. I stop in a gift shop, the only place open, and find a book on the saint's life. But as the train pulls out of the city at dusk, I can't focus on the words. I put the book on the seat beside me and close my eyes. I see myself already back in Florence. For a moment, I am in two places at once. It is always this way when you travel. You exist in two places at once, as two people at once. There is the place you are now and the imagined place you are going, where you are already wandering streets, having dinner, strolling back to your hotel. There is the you that is here and the future you already there, smiling and confident. And that future place is not a busy intersection in Florence at night, or a darkened alley where words chase me. It is not the place I feel I am perched, always precariously perched these days. The future place is better, and in it is a better me. Not the me riding lonely on a train, running from everything I knew and everything I was, but the me that is knowing, flirtatious, unfettered, savvy, healed. The thought is reassuring, but then it turns and is terrifying. That future woman is not me, and I know how she will look at me, the past her. I know how she will pity, patronize, want to expunge, destroy. She will say, I remember what I was before I learned. She will want to erase what is mine. But this is me, and this is mine. This lonely train ride is mine, too. Out the window is a parade of shadows, and I am a single point in the dark, one lit window passing by. This is the first day, I think, looking out at the darkness and seeing suddenly my own face. This is the first day of the rest. This is the first day, this is the first, the rest, your life. Then the rest of your life. What if this is the rest of your life? But this is the place where I am, on a train, in the dark. And in truth, the place that I'm going doesn't exist. She does not yet exist. Thank you very much.
So when I was explaining Geoff's book to someone the other day after having read it, I said, it's half modern American Siddhartha Buddhist tale, half born action movie. In his review in the LA Times book review, Ramsey Matthews says, Miranda is about how people break down, what causes us to break down, and how we can manage after breaking down. Nicholson's quirky book is about defense mechanisms, healing systems, recovery, and survival. This is Geoff.
Good enough, yeah. Okay, well, I mean, one of them, the MacGuffin of the book is you've got a character there who decides he wants to walk around the world, but he's an agoraphobic, so he can't leave his own backyard. But he happens to have a garden path that is exactly 100 yards long. So he works out, so it's 25,000 miles around to walk around the circumference of the Earth. So, you know, you do the math, however many circumferences he needs to do. And of course there is a good reason for his agoraphobia, which becomes, that's the born identity. Yeah, that's really good. So this is from an early chapter, but it's about walking and the nature of walking. Shared enthusiasms always make for strange bedfellows, fellows you definitely wouldn't want to get in bed with. This is even true of walkers. They come in all sizes and shapes, with all kinds of personalities, motives, and ideologies. The Buddha, certainly, as my mailman seemed to know, and Jesus, of course, and Moses, obviously, and all the Muslims walking around Mecca, and Mao on his long march, to name just a few. To be honest, I didn't think I had a lot in common with any of these characters. The truth was, I thought I had much more in common with Albert Speer, chief architect of the Third Reich, confidant of Adolf Hitler, and eventually his minister for armaments and war production. Did I regard Albert Speer as a role model? No, I did not. As an inspiration? Well, no, of course not. He was a Nazi, but he did seem, in certain ways, to be a fellow traveler. In September 1954, Speer decided to walk from Berlin to Heidelberg, a distance of 345 miles. Since he was incarcerated in Spandau Ballet, how did that come from? Since he was incarcerated in Spandau prison at the time, his walk had to be a theoretical one. Speer paced out a walking path in the prison garden, a garden he himself had designed, and a plot considerably bigger than my own yard. His course, and he thought metrically, was 270 meters long, near enough 300 yards. Then he began a journey that would require him to make just over 2,296 circuits of that course. In some, although not always, his project was less ambitious than mine. He set himself the task of walking just 7 kilometers a day, really not very ambitious at all, but ultimately he'd keep walking for a full 12 years, which still strikes me as very impressive. I didn't see myself walking for nearly that long. Once I'd walked around the world, I intended to stop, and I would find some new obsession. Speer made detailed records of his walking, marking off the days, noting the distances covered, along with daily, weekly, and overall totals and averages. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy in the Nazi Party, who was also an inmate of Spandau, helped Speer to keep count. I would have no equivalent of Hess, but clearly record keeping was going to be important. I didn't care about proving to anybody that I'd covered the distance, but if I didn't keep accurate records, I'd never know how far I walked, nor how far I still had to go. I wouldn't even know when I'd finished. My perfectly simple recording method consisted of making many, many hash marks arranged in groups of 5, like a 5-bar gate, on the pages of a series of small, unmatching notebooks, which I'd then store in a footlocker. In truth, I don't know where Speer stored his records, but I do know that he completed his journey to Heidelberg on March the 19th, 1955. His 50th birthday is at hand. Pleased with what he'd accomplished, he then decided he might as well keep going and make another imaginary journey. This time, he'd walk to Munich and beyond, and again, Rudolf Hess tried to be helpful and suggested that Speer could walk all the way to Asia if he wanted to. Speer liked the idea, but he fretted that any route he chose would involve walking through some dreadful communist countries. He couldn't face that, not even in his imagination. I think that Speer's walk is an interesting case. As his feet trod the path in the Spandau prison garden, his mind took him to places in the real world, outside the prison, the places he'd have gone if he'd actually been walking in that world. He even persuaded the prison library to buy him maps and travel guides so he could imagine the journey that much more accurately. According to Speer's published diary, he and Hess had some discussions about whether his walking was inherently sane. Speer at first claimed that it wasn't, and he wrote in his diary, "I insisted on my claim to have a screw loose." This is a translation, of course, but it's still a strange thing for anybody to insist on, it seems to me, unless he calculated that symptoms of insanity might speed up his release. Hess, however, wasn't buying it. "That just happens to be your pastime," he said. quite reasonably, it seems to me. And this is surely one of the very rare occasions in history when a person is tempted to side with Rudolf Hess rather than Albert Speer. By September the 18th, 1956, Speer had come round to Hess's point of view and didn't think his walking was so very crazy after all. In fact, he now saw it as a sign of sanity. He wrote in his diary on that day, "I have walked 3,326 kilometers. Counting the winter, that makes a daily average of 9.1 kilometers. As long as I continue my tramping, I shall remain on an even keel." Apart from the walking, I've never had any desire to emulate Albert Speer in any conceivable way. Equally, it never occurred to me that walking would be the means either of proving or disproving my sanity. I've always been well aware, both personally and professionally, that trying to prove your sanity to other people is a fool's game. Proving it to yourself strikes me as even more of a problem.
So as you can imagine, when I was asked to do this, and I'm reading a book set in Florence about a woman dealing with an eating disorder and a man walking around with comparisons to the Nazis that he is walking, there were a lot of things that I was trying to figure out exactly how I was going to put all this together, and it actually works out really well. There are a lot of common themes between these books that I'm going to talk about, and the first one I think is there's a psychological aspect to each of your novels, and I'm going to have you each kind of talk to that. First, Jessie, your book is about a woman with an eating disorder, and I don't know many books about actual women. It's usually novels about young girls.
Yeah.
So what about this and having this story told was important to you?
Sure, it's a great question. So I guess the book is not my own experience and Hannah is not me, but I did have some experience with an eating disorder years ago. And at the time, you know, after I sort of got over it very quickly and had a lot of support from friends and family and felt fortunate in that. But it left me with a lot of questions, and I did what I always do, and I went to books. And I didn't find a lot of books for adults, and I was an adult at the time that I experienced this, that dealt with that. And so when I began the novel, I wanted to kind of write the book that I hadn't found and provide a perspective on the experience of an eating disorder as I had experienced it. And it also came out of, I mean, I think a lot of writing comes out of the sort of what ifs. So things happen in your life and you wonder what would have happened if things had gone a different direction. And so this book in part came out of that. And then I guess I also hope, I mean, though an eating disorder is at the center of it, I hope that it will speak to anybody who's ever lost themselves in any way, whether to addiction or depression or an unhealthy relationship, you know, whatever that is. I hope that it speaks to that experience of kind of becoming a stranger to yourself and then trying to find your way back or find your way back to the new person you might be.
I think what's really telling is when you talk about eating disorders, a lot of people have them when they're young, but there's not a conversation. They never go away. There's something internally that you deal with forever, and I think that's kind of what Hannah is dealing with, the fact that she's going to have this, and how is she going to move forward and be who she wants to be within inside her. So it's a really powerful story.
Thank you.
Now, Geoff, I think it's not a spoiler. Can you tell people what your main character does
sure.
for a living at the start of your book?
What he's done, yeah. Well, I mean, at the bottom of both these questions is where we find our novels, where we find our material.
Yeah.
And I was talking to someone whose boyfriend was in the British RAF, and at that time he was flying bombing missions into Iraq. And there was every likelihood that he might be shot down. And if he was shot down and it was a ball of flame, then it was all over. But if he bailed out, parachuted down, and was captured, he was almost certainly going to be tortured. And in order to prepare him for this, he was tortured by members of his own side. And he refused, he wouldn't talk even to his wife about it, so he said he wouldn't talk to me. But this was floating around. And that was sort of a seed somewhere in the back of my head. I mean, partly, because I like coming up sideways on stories. So I thought, well, yeah, you could have a guy who was tortured, but isn't it more interesting to think, well, who are these guys who do the training? The guys who torture, the good torturers who torture our side, so that they can cope with the bad torturers on their side. So he's the guy, and he's walking around in his yard, and because we've all read books before, we know that something's going to come back. That he's hiding from something, and it will arrive, and he knows it, and we know it. And it kind of does, but not quite as expected, of course.
Well, he kind of has a sense, I kind of felt like he had a sense of, it wasn't guilt, but kind of sort of this buyer's remorse almost for what he had been doing for so long. And yes, you're right. As a reader, you know something's going to come back and take it on in the end. But I wanted to talk a little bit about guilt, because the book definitely deals with a man trying to think about what he did and why he did it and how he arrived there. How did you sort of tackle that topic?
Well, I mean, as Jessie said, I mean, we're not the characters we write, but at the same time, in some way, you are when you write it. You put yourself in that character. You try to feel things, and of course, you try to imagine things that you haven't felt in your day-to-day life. I did talk to one or two other military guys who. No one would talk to me directly. Maybe if it had been a journalistic expose, I could have tracked somebody down. So I mean, it is a work of the imagination. But trying to imagine how you sustain the sense of yourself as a good person, as a person doing good work for the right side, for the best possible motives. And yet, at the end of the day, you're putting someone in a stressed position in a concrete bunker and giving them the works. And at the end of it, you let them out, and supposedly they're better for it. But it's just that interesting contradiction. I mean, that there's clearly a moral problem there, and there isn't a very simple moral answer. It seems to me. I mean, in the world or in the book.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think your character tackles it from a bunch of different perspectives to give you as the reader different ideas where you can take it moving forward from there. So I thought that was very well done. I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it because I was like, could I do this man's job? If that was what I was charged with, could I do it? And no, I can't.
Well, and again, he didn't wake up one day and decide that was the job for him. He kind of, there was a slow drift. And, and so as moral problems are, you start out, very black and white, and it becomes ever more complicated and grey.
Well, and
very kind of you.
Where did that place come from? Why that place?
Oh, I went to my girlfriend's old house. It's as simple as that. I mean, with a few tweaks for the sake of, for the sake of a good story.
Yes.
But she had a house on a plot of land with a path around it.
And how did that path become part of your story? How how did you arrive that this path was going to be how your person experienced this story?
Well, I live in LA, which is a driving town. And of course, I immediately before LA, I was in New York, and before that I was in London. These are these great walking towns, supposedly. And when I got to LA, I was, everything seemed good, but I was really, really depressed. And I didn't really know why. And I don't know, it was absolutely cause and effect. But I decided, and I didn't want to leave the house. I absolutely didn't want to leave the house. And, I talked to a lot of people in LA. In New York, everyone lives in horrible little apartments, so they kind of have to go out there. And so, I sort of had the same dilemma that he has, that I wanted to walk, I wanted to explore, but at the same time, not nearly as extremely as my character, but I had some sense that, I didn't really want to go out there. I wanted to stay where I was. And, and the only way to overcome it is to overcome it. You go out there and do it. So this is making it sound probably more autobiographical than I think it is. But so yeah, I mean, you take a thing that's yours and you amplify it and twist it, and is that a reasonable answer?
Absolutely. And then, Jessie, I mean, I've never been to Florence, but after reading your book, I feel like I could definitely see these places in my head. It's beautiful. It is really beautiful. Why Florence? What was the draw to Florence?
Sure. I guess, I mean, I had spent time there. I studied abroad in Florence in college, and so it was a city that I knew somewhat. And it was a city that kind of gripped me right away. I mean, it's so beautiful. It's filled with so much history. You literally can't, turn a corner without kind of running into it. But it's also a place that operates like, for a city that really operates like a small town. And I don't know, it's interesting. I was thinking as I was reading your book, Geoff, that we both have characters who are in some way trying to be anonymous, actually, and yet they keep running into people who interrupt that. And so for Hannah, she's kind of running away from herself and her own history, but she's in this place that's dense with history and that operates like a small town, and that's highly social. And so as much as she's isolated at the opening, she inevitably gets sort of drawn into the life of that city. I was also interested in writing about Florence as a city that I love and that's been very written about, and trying to write about it a bit differently and show some parts of the city that maybe you don't see the first time that you're there, or if you're there for a short amount of time. So the rowing club that Hannah joins is a club that actually exists, and it's on the Arno River, and it's located under the Uffizi Gallery, which is perhaps one of the most touristed parts of the city. And then right below it, there's this place that's completely Florentine. And so I was interested in sort of putting her in that community. And then I think also that the history of the women, the history of the saints, I didn't originally intend for them to be a part of the book, but I was writing the scene that I read to you and doing some research into what would Hannah see if she went into this basilica, and what would that mean to her. And as I began sort of looking up at the time on the computer of the images of St. Catherine there and her mummified head, et cetera, and then reading about some of her history and some of her writing, I realized that these women from the past were relevant to what I was doing in the present. And that really expanded the book for me. And it also changed Italy for me. It changed the city of Florence for me, looking at it through the lens of these women who aren't always the first people who come to mind when you're thinking about Italy.
Yeah. That kind of bridges into a topic I was going to discuss. Both of your books have sort of this religious, I'm going to call it a cloud. But Catholicism sits over your book. Buddhism kind of sits over your book and informs the characters as they walk, right?
Yeah.
Walks through Florence and walks in circles. So I thought maybe you could talk. Was it an accidental finding and you were just doing that, or was it a cognizant effort? You were like, you know what, this is going, for you it sounds like it was an accident as you were writing the scene. It just worked, and then that might be the brilliance of writing. But talk about that a little bit and how Catholicism sort of sits for your character as an eye-opening experience as she learns about these things.
Sure. So I'm not Catholic by background. It was, again, not a part of the plan to have Catholicism and the saints be a part of this book. And it's not a book about a woman finding religion in any way, but it was an accident, and a happy accident. And I began thinking about these women, and less so in terms of their faith, meaning in terms of the belief system that they kind of discovered that became the center of their meaning. And that what was really maybe most fascinating to me was that you had these women in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries who were able to in some way create this autonomous existence, and that was within the structure of the Catholic Church, certainly, but it became a way to kind of resistance, right, and a way of kind of not living the lives that had been laid out for them, and allowed them to maintain control of their bodies and their thoughts. And as soon as they were talking about having a direct relationship with God, I mean, that in itself is incredible, and being able to express themselves in that way. And then there was their writing about their ecstatic experiences. And so I was also interested in that, because it was, you know, on the one hand, it's this incredible, beautiful, overwhelming, addictive experience. But like any addiction, they also describe it as the sort of pain from coming out of that experience. And so for a woman who's been dealing with a kind of addiction that gave her a high, but was also obviously incredibly self-destructive and painful, I was interested in looking at that sort of dichotomy and how that played out.
It's fascinating. So your character, there's another character in Geoff's book who is the postman, and he gives him this Buddhist statue, really?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That's
And it kind of informs even the main character to maybe his own Buddhist leanings. So talk to me a little bit about that and how that...
Well, I mean, unlike Jessie, I do have a semi-Catholic background. My mom was Catholic, my dad was a Protestant, and if they got married in a Catholic church, and as you probably know, if you get married in a Catholic church, you have to swear that you're going to bring the children up as good Catholics. My parents must have had some argument about that off stage before I arrived, and I was brought up in this strange, irreligious. I mean, it's not pagan exactly, but I didn't really know what. I mean, I learned about it at school, but I didn't really know what religion was. And I certainly didn't go into a church except for a wedding or a christening until I was in my 20s. But at university, I was fascinated. I mean, and I guess this gave me a fascination about religion and what is it and what do people get out of it. And the kind of mysticism that we're talking about here, that you don't need the church, you don't need the priest, you're in direct communication with God. That's fascinating to me. And at college, I studied the English medieval mystics, the Cloud of Unknowing, Marjorie Kemp, Julian of Norwich. And I think there was a bit of me that said, I'd like some of that. I'd like to have the visions. I'd like to have the direct communication with God. And I never really have. And of course, as a student of literature, you read T.S. Eliot, and he talks about the moment in and out of time. And I think I know what he's talking about, but I'm not sure I've ever really experienced it. And certain kinds of physical activity, like walking, and people who run and swim tell me this, that there is some kind of, it's partly meditative and partly, ecstatic, might be an exaggeration, but yeah, I mean, our man is heading towards this, he's into the constant walking as a form of meditation, and he's not, he knows he's not doing it to get enlightened, but he's surrounded by these people who are asking him, what's he doing? Some people say, oh, you're doing it for charity, or you're doing it for a bet, or you're doing it to find enlightenment, or to save the earth. And he said, no, I'm not really doing that. But it's certainly one of the things I think about. And I wrote a previous book called The Lost Art of Walking, which is exactly, it's a non-fiction book about the ways and the reasons that people walk. And yeah, the sort of sacramental walkers, people like Bruce Chatwin and maybe Werner Herzog, he did the famous walk from Munich to Paris. I love all that stuff, and I admire it. And I think I probably admire it so much because I don't quite get it. I don't get enough of it, or it's somehow over there. It's a topic for a book rather than something I've never experienced.
Well, I think what's interesting is that oftentimes there are people who do an action, and it's actually what people are thinking about the action or how they're viewing the action that creates what the action means.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that happens in your book to his neighbors who think he's doing something completely different than he's really trying to do. And he has some interesting neighbors, you guys. So definitely learn about them and stuff. So I think that's really an interesting idea, this sort of, he's not doing it, but it kind of is there.
Yeah, and people project onto him what they think he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I told you guys I was going to do this. So one of the most important things for me when I read a book, and this may be for you guys as readers, is I look for that nugget of wisdom that I'm going to take away from that book and think about and chew on for a while. So I have a nugget from each of their books that I've chosen And I'm actually going to have...
I'm terrified.
And I'm actually going to ask them each to read the nugget from each other's books so you guys can kind of see. So I'm going to start with having Geoff read. It's a little bit, it's this underlying portion right there.
Is it, shall I stand up or is it okay if I just read it from here? It's quite short. Yeah.
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 I wrote it in pencil, so I was like, I hope people can see it.
I am filled with the magic of the afternoon, changed by it. And in that instant, I have again the sense of being ahead of myself, far in the future. Only this time I'm not afraid of that future woman who would look back on the younger woman whose journey was more difficult, covered in sharp edges and dark crevices, finding her way for the first time to this place, uncertain of which way she would pitch or how she would emerge. I don't look back then, but walk quickly ahead before anything else takes hold. I leave the saints and their insatiable ecstasies, leave that lost woman. I walk quickly toward the city, toward food, toward all the things that are just beginning to grow. So good. It's nice.
It's so good. And then I have a little page here from Geoff's book, if you could read that for me.
I love this book, by the way. I just read it this past week. It's so good. There were days when walking around the path in my yard was simply very pleasurable to me, when it seemed very easy, when I did 25 miles with amazingly little effort. Then again, of course, there were other days when it felt much harder, when it felt like work, sometimes like very hard work indeed, even with a cocktail inside me. There were days when I had various aches and pains in my bones and muscles, when walking simply hurt. Well, who would expect anything else?
I think that that's life. I think that quote just signifies life and so much. So I thought I would end before we get to some questions from the audience. What do you guys want people to take away from your book? Like, what is your nugget?
I really don't have an answer to that. I mean, you said it before.
I warned you.
I mean, I do want people to be entertained in some way, at some level. It's not a lesson. It's not a learning experience. I guess it's kind of. I mean, I get called a satirist, and I don't even know what that means, but it does mean. It implies a kind of subversion, that you think about things as they are one way, and then you kind of turn them around and think about them another way, and then maybe turn them again. So that, a good satire isn't just black is white, white is black. White becomes black, black becomes white, but then, it goes halfway back again, or it becomes multicolored. So, I mean, I passionately want people to make up their own mind, not take anything for granted, It's weird to be inside this character's head for a whole book, because he is a strange character and not a good man in the ordinary sense of the word. People tell me he's likable. I obviously liked him when I was writing it, because I haven't been able to write a character that I don't like at some level. Is that part of an answer?
That's a great answer. And Jessie?
So I guess a few things. I mean, I would like. I hope in the book I challenge maybe some stereotypes around eating disorders and what those experiences are like, and give people a way of connecting to that. And I suppose also challenge some stereotypes around Italy and provide maybe a slightly different vision of Florence. And I guess primarily, I mean, I thought a lot, I won't give anything away, but I thought a lot about the ending of the book, and particularly writing about an issue that affects a lot of people. And I think not just people who I think that there are a lot of people who are in some way at war with their bodies, or have a complicated relationship to food. That's pretty prevalent in our country. And so I thought a lot about where this journey would go, and so I hope people will leave the book feeling like it is authentic, but also hopeful, and recognizing that, you know, we have these things that we carry, and that they remain a part of our lives, and that's okay too. That part of that moving forward and finding a way forward is coming to terms with the things that we do carry with us, whatever they are.
So can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You said it's a thing that it's a problem in this country,
Yeah.
in America. Do the Italians regard it in the same way? Do they have? I mean, I don't imagine they eat the same way that we do.
No.
So do they have the same attitude towards eating disorders? Do they have eating disorders in the way that Americans do?
I mean, I looked at it, well, I sort of did some research to it
Sure.
while I was there, and it certainly exists, and absolutely there are complicated, like, gender politics that play out in Italy, and those have to do with youth and beauty. So there's a woman who Hannah runs into in the book who's older than her, who is sort of obsessed with how she looks, and that's really important to her kind of position and her position of power in the community too. But, you know, I think that we, in America in any case, we have a pretty, we go to extremes with food, right? And that in Italy it's a cliche, but also a truth, that there is a more balanced relationship with that. And so, as a place for Hannah, it seemed like something that could challenge some of her extremes too. So I think you're right, there's a different relationship with food that's quite a bit more healthy.
No, I mean,
and
I
balanced.
totally accept you're writing a novel. You're not writing a primer on eating disorders around the world.
No, but you have to do your research.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, I wanted to open it up to you guys. Do you guys have any questions you would like to ask either Geoff or Jessie regarding their books or their writing process or anything like that? I know that you have a lot of family, so they probably have talked to you about it. But did you guys have any questions before we end everything?
Don't be shy.
Is that it for Hannah? Like, are we going to see anything else about her? Or are we just left with
I will
that?
probably leave the story where it is. It feels like, you know, I feel like it closes where it closes. I've had people ask me, what happens to her next? What do you think happens to her? And, you know, I want to leave that to the reader. And so I think this is the end, although we'll see. Maybe in a few years she'll come knocking again.
I mean, it is a question you get asked as a novelist.
Yeah.
What next? Is there going to be a sequel? And I've always, I mean, with one exception, I've always kind of felt when the book ends, it ends. But there's no reason why it should.
I think the best novels have you sit there and want that sequel. They
Yeah.
want, but it allows you to do what you need to in your head, because you can write the sequel however you want. Hannah's adventure, or even Joe at the end of this book, what is he going to do next? You
Well,
can
that's a big
allow-
question. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, my question for both of you is, you know, when you're in process, what does your day, what does your week look like?
You can go first. I mean, I'm happy to
I
go.
think
No.
when I'm in a project, it's pretty intense. So I'll try to spend most of the day writing, and break it up with walking when I sort of hit a wall and need to process. But I usually write pretty, like, when I don't write every day when I'm not in the middle of a project. But on the days that I do write, I try to write full days. And when I'm in project, I'm pretty obsessed. And happily, I'm married to a writer who understands that too, so we can both sort of go
Sounds
into
like
our
sheer
holes
hell.
and just sit there.
No, I'm married to a publisher, so it's even worse. Yeah, I mean, my process is very similar. It's different, you know, depending on what, how far along you are with a novel, with a project. But there's certainly the early part, which I enjoy the most, is that, you know, you've really got to get up in the morning and, you know, you've got to write your 1,000 words that day or your 1,500 words that day, because otherwise you haven't got any, you know, you haven't got a novel. You can't, you know, it can't be 20 pages. You know, there's got to be at least 200 or 300. And I always feel it's easier to rewrite than it is to write. You know, that once you've got it there, you can kind of knock it about and change it. And but that's how I find that. I mean, I enjoy editing.
So for you, the scoping part is the more interesting part, you're saying, in that first phase?
Yeah, I think so, because it's hard. It's the hard work,
yeah.
because, you know, you've got to actually accumulate the words. I mean, there are pleasures all the way along. I mean, and agonies all the way along. But yeah, I mean, it's an office job basically, apart from the walking. You get up in the morning and you go to your desk and, you know, and work until it. And I mean, you know, and there are days that I find that, you know, I know it's not going to be a great day, but you know, you don't give up. You just, you know, you carry on working. All right, I do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else before we? You guys are going to sign books after? So I want to thank Jessie and I want to thank Geoff very much for coming. I want to thank East Bay Booksellers for letting us do this here. So thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Russell.
Oh.
And thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Roselle. Thank you, Jessie.